In May 2020, as the world shut down and families sheltered in place, a father and his teenage son set out for what should have been a simple 3-day camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. They never came home. For 5 years, their disappearance haunted Tennessee, one of the most chilling mysteries in the state's history, until researchers' drone captured something hidden deep in the wilderness. What it revealed would not only unravel the mystery, but expose a truth so devastating it would tear a family apart forever. On May 14, 2020, Daniel Rivera loaded up his aging Ford Explorer with camping gear. His 16-year-old son, Joshua, sat beside him in the passenger seat, earbuds dangling, backpack at his feet. For anyone watching them leave Millbrook that evening, it looked like nothing more than a father and son retreat. Two people escaping pandemic monotony for fresh mountain air. But beneath the surface, there were cracks no one yet saw. Daniel, a 42-year-old contractor, had been restless since March. Work had dried up during lockdowns, bills piled, and arguments with his wife, Elena, had grown louder and more frequent. Those close to him noticed something different in his eyes, an edge of desperation that wasn't there before. Yet, when Daniel mentioned a camping trip, Elena assumed it was his way of reconnecting with Josh. Their relationship had been strained, teenage rebellion clashing with father's frustration. Perhaps, she thought, the mountains would help them find common ground. She kissed her son on the forehead, reminded him to be safe, and watched as the Explorer pulled out of the driveway for what would unknowingly be the last time. The Smokies that week were uncharacteristically quiet. With travel restrictions and closed facilities, the usual hum of tourists had vanished. Rangers described the park as eerily still, just trees, streams, and the occasional echo of wildlife. For Daniel, this meant isolation. For Josh, it meant unease. According to Josh's last text to his girlfriend, Lily Tran, he wasn't thrilled about the trip. At 16, video calls and late-night chats with Lily mattered more than hiking. But in the days that followed, those texts would take on a haunting weight. He says we'll be gone 3 days. No service where we're headed. If I don't text, don't freak out. By the evening of May 15th, the Rivera's Explorer was parked at a remote trailhead. A ranger later noted the car seemed oddly overpacked. Supplies stacked for far longer than 3 days. Still, the entry log showed Daniel's neat handwriting. Rivera, party of 2. It would be the last official record of them alive. When Elena didn't hear from her husband or son by the 18th, she tried to dismiss her worry. But by the 19th, panic settled in. Daniel's brother, Raphael, drove to the trailhead and found the Explorer still there, dust gathering on its hood. No signs of movement, no messages, no calls. The search began the next morning. At first, optimism carried the volunteers and rangers. Missing hikers were not uncommon, and most were found within days. But as hours turned into days, the Rivera's trail became more confusing. Ranger Kyle Bennett, one of the first on the scene, later recalled the strangeness. Their campsite didn't add up. Food was left untouched. A map had been torn in half, and there were boot prints in the mud. Daniel's and Josh's side by side. But then they just stopped, like the earth had swallowed them. Bloodhounds were brought in, but struggled with the scent. Drones scanned the canopy, but returned only empty footage of endless green. Each day, the search grew more desperate, stretching deeper into ravines, caves, and ridgelines. But each night, teams returned empty-handed. By June, the Rivera case was already being called one of the most baffling disappearances in the Smokies' history. The pandemic complicated every effort. Fewer volunteers, limited resources, media more focused on rising case counts than a missing father and son. To Elena, it felt like screaming into a void, her family's tragedy eclipsed by the world's larger crisis. Detective Isabel Cruz, assigned to the case, described Elena as a mother suspended between hope and horror. She clutched Josh's old baseball cap during interviews, repeating the same question over and over. How does someone just vanish out there? Both of them. Even in those early weeks, theories began to swirl. Some whispered that Daniel had staged it, escaping debt, fleeing responsibility, dragging his son with him. Others believe an accident had claimed them both, but no evidence supported either theory. All that remained were traces, The abandoned car, the half-used supplies, the footprints ending mid-trail. The Smokies are vast, over 500,000 acres of ridges, hollows, and wilderness with a human eye can only see so far. Locals often say the mountains keep their secrets. And in May 2020, they took Daniel and Joshua Rivera into their depths, leaving only silence behind. The disappearance became a wound in the community, reopening each time hikers spotted something strange. A scrap of fabric, initials carved into bark, a campsite disturbed. Each lead sparked hope, then collapsed into nothing. For Elena, nights grew unbearable. She left Josh's room untouched, his sneakers still by the door, his school books open on the desk. She replayed the memory of him walking out that May evening, wishing she had held him tighter, wishing she had stopped them both. 5 years later, the truth would emerge. But in 2020, all anyone knew was this. A father and son had entered the Smokies, and the Smokies had swallowed them whole. On May 20th, 2020, the official search for Daniel and Joshua Rivera began in earnest. A dozen rangers, 4 search dogs, and a handful of volunteers combed the trails leading out from the Cosby entrance of the Great Smoky Mountains. Their target was simple: trace the Rivera's last known steps. Their challenge, however, was staggering. The Smokies were over 500,000 acres of tangled wilderness. Caves, cliffs, rivers, and valleys that swallowed even the most seasoned hikers. For Elena Rivera, each passing hour felt like a lifetime. Standing at the trailhead where Daniel's 4 explorers sat abandoned, she clutched the straps of Josh's backpack, a pack he had forgotten to take with him. The police had already marked it as odd. If they were planning 3 days out there, why would Josh leave half his supplies in the car? Detective Isabel Cruz, who had worked her share of missing persons cases, felt uneasy. Something about this scene didn't fit the pattern. Usually you'll find breadcrumbs, broken branches, dropped food wrappers, campfire remains. With the Riveras, everything was neat. Too neat. It looked staged. The search dogs were the first to reveal something unsettling. Mark Holloway, a seasoned K9 handler, brought in 2 bloodhounds trained specifically for wilderness tracking. They picked up the Rivera scent easily from the car and followed it along the main trail. For nearly a mile, the dogs pulled hard, barking as if chasing a clear lead. But then, without warning, both stopped dead at the same bend in the trail. They circled, whined, and sat down. They acted, Holloway later explained, like the trail just ended. No fade, no confusion. Just gone, like the people vanished into thin air. This became the case's first great puzzle. The footprints found near that spot were Daniel's size and Josh's size, distinct and side by side. But just like the dogs' noses, the tracks stopped abruptly in the mud. No continuation. No signs of a struggle. No indication of where they went next. By May 23rd, the search expanded. Helicopters flew overhead, rangers scoured ravines, and drones buzzed through the canopy. Yet the Smokies are deceptive. Foliage so thick that even a few feet can conceal someone from the air. Rescuers describe a forest as swallowing sound. Radios crackle with static. Shouts carried only yards before dissolving into silence. For volunteers, it became a nightmare terrain. Some swore they heard voices at night, echoes bouncing between ridges. Others reported an uncanny feeling of being watched, as if the woods themselves bristled at their intrusion. Ranger Kyle Bennett dismissed it as stress and fatigue, but the stories circulated all the same. By May 28th, with no progress, hope began to wane. Media coverage was scarce, overshadowed by the pandemic's rising death tolls and constant headlines. Elena pleaded for attention, her face appearing on local broadcasts, her voice trembling. "My husband and son are out there. Please don't forget them. Please don't let them fade." But in a country gripped by fear, the Rivera's disappearance became little more than a footnote. Detective Cruz refused to let it go. She pressed harder into Daniel's background. Debt collectors. A recent argument with his brother Raphael. Strange, late-night purchases of camping gear weeks before the trip. A trail of tension that pointed to a man under pressure. Yet Cruz also noticed the subtle details that didn't fit the runaway father theory. Daniel had packed too much food for 3 days, but not enough for a permanent disappearance. His bank accounts remained untouched. His phone went dark within hours of entering the park. If this was planned, it was sloppy. If it wasn't, then it was something far stranger. Theories began to bubble online. Some claimed Rivera had encountered wildlife, a bear attack, perhaps, but no remains, no blood, no signs of violence supported that. Others whispered about the Smokies' darker reputation. Caves where people vanish, old Cherokee legends of spirits in the ridgelines, stories of hikers stepping off-trail only to never be seen again. One theory, however, spread faster than the rest, that Daniel Rivera had snapped. Isolation, financial collapse, a crumbling marriage. Had he led Josh into the wilderness with darker intentions? The very thought tore Elena in two. She defended him fiercely, but doubt gnawed at her in the quiet hours of the night. By June 5th, after nearly 3 weeks, the official search was scaled back. Rangers packed their tents, volunteers drifted home, and Rivera's case was reclassified as unsolved missing persons. For Elena, this was the cruelest cut. Watching the last search helicopter lift off, she felt the weight of abandonment. The forest had not given her answers, only silence. The car remained at the trailhead, a grim marker of absence, a reminder that the people she loved most had walked into the Smokies and never returned. Raphael, Daniel's brother, grew restless. He organized his own searches, insisting they hadn't gone far. But each effort ended the same, with weary men staring into endless green, asking the same unanswerable question. Where did they go? The Smokies are older than memory itself. They have taken lives before, and they will take them again. But in the summer of 2020, their silence deepened into something more sinister. The Rivera's disappearance wasn't just another tragic hiking accident. It was a wound that refused to heal, a question that refused to be answered. And as the months turned into years, the mystery only grew darker. Because if the forest hadn't claimed them, then what had? Before we continue, if stories like this pull you in, if you find yourself searching for answers long after the video ends, make sure you're subscribed. These are the mysteries we uncover every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. By the winter of 2020, the disappearance of Daniel and Joshua Rivera had slipped quietly out of national headlines. Overshadowed by the pandemic, political unrest, and daily tragedies, their story was relegated to the back pages of local papers. To most, they were simply 2 more names added to the Smokies' long history of vanished hikers. But for the Rivera family, the silence was unbearable. Every day that passed without answers felt like betrayal. Elena Rivera moved through her house like a ghost, Josh's room untouched, his poster still taped to the wall, his bed neatly made. She replayed the last conversation they had, Josh's voice casual, excited. "It's just 3 days, Mom. We'll be back before you know it." He never came back. Detective Isabel Cruz refused to let the case fade. Something about the Riveras gnawed at her. Details that didn't align with the tidy explanations others leaned on. Cruz spent hours revisiting ranger logs, GPS records, and drone footage. Nothing changed. The trail ended where it always did, at that strange bend where the dogs had lost the scent, where footprints stopped cold. Cruz admitted later, it wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It felt like we were staring at a hole in reality. Everything pointed to them existing, right there, and then nothing. No exit trail. No physical evidence. Just erasure. By early 2021, speculation flourished online. True crime forums picked up the story, dissecting every scrap of public record. Reddit threads debated endlessly. Theory 1, Daniel staged it. A father running from debt, dragging his son into hiding. Theory 2, a tragic accident. They'd slipped into one of the Smokies' countless ravines or caves. Their remains hidden, waiting to be discovered. Theory 3, something darker, cults, cartels, or even paranormal forces. The most unsettling detail, repeated over and over, both men's tracks stopped mid-trail in clear mud. No continuation. No drag marks. No scuffle. Just silence. It was enough to give the case a nickname online, the Vanishing Trail. Meanwhile, Raphael Rivera grew restless. He could not accept official inaction. By spring 2021, he was organizing his own private searches with volunteers, college kids, amateur explorers, even conspiracy theorists who wanted to chase their own answers. One group claimed to have found something chilling, a crude shelter deep in the woods, with what looked like scraps of clothing nearby. But when investigators returned days later, the shelter was gone, torn apart, nothing left but disturbed earth and branches. Raphael swore the forest was hiding something. It's like it doesn't want to give them back, like it keeps swallowing what little we find. The strain on the family was brutal. Elena and Raphael argued constantly. He believed Daniel may have deliberately vanished, pulling Josh with him. Elena rejected this fiercely, insisting Daniel loved his son too much to destroy his life. But privately, doubt lingered. The fights Daniel had with Raphael about money, his recent withdrawal from friends, the weight of 2020 pressing on him, like it pressed on everyone. Could he have broken under the pressure? Still, there was one unshakable truth. No one runs into the Smokies without leaving a trace. And Daniel had left none. By late 2021, the Rivera's case joined the grim catalog of unresolved mysteries in the Smoky Mountains. Names like Trenny Gibson and Dennis Martin, vanished decades earlier, were invoked in whispers. Locals muttered about the Smokies being hungry, about the mountains taking who they wanted and never giving them back. Even rangers admitted, off the record, that the case unnerved them. One said quietly, "I've been here 20 years, seen dozens of searches, but I've never seen a trail just stop. Not like that. It keeps me up at night." The case file grew thicker, but the answers remained absent. For Elena, it was torture. Holidays passed with 2 empty chairs at the table. Birthdays arrived with candles blown out in silence. She began to write letters to her missing son and husband, tucking them into a drawer she could barely bring herself to open. The world moved on. The Riveras were forgotten by most. But the Smokies remembered, and so did Detective Cruz. She never closed the file, never stopped circling back, looking for patterns. She believed, deep down, that something would eventually surface. And in February 2022, it did. A wildlife researcher flying a drone over a remote section of forest, nearly 6 miles from the Rivera's last known location, captured something in the canopy. At first, it looked like debris, just another tangle of branches and leaves. But as the footage was reviewed later, frame by frame, a shape emerged. Faded nylon, canvas, a hint of blue fabric, a tent. The footage was grainy, obscured by branches, but one detail stood out with gut-wrenching clarity. The tent appeared collapsed, as if no one had touched it in years. And inside the half-open flap, something pale, something that didn't belong. It was enough to reopen the case, enough to breathe life into a mystery that had, for nearly 2 years, lain dormant. The vanishing trail wasn't closed. It was only just beginning. When investigators pieced together what little evidence they had in the early days of the Rivera case, it was like staring into fog, shapes of something there, but never clear enough to grasp. The search teams had returned with nothing conclusive. No clothing, no torn gear, no obvious sign of a struggle. Just that ominous silence in the backcountry. By late 2020, weeks had turned into months, and the hope of finding Daniel and Josh alive had quietly begun to fade. But it wasn't until the following spring that the first real breakthrough surfaced, hidden not in the forest, but in the very belongings left behind. In April 2021, a seasonal worker cleaning out a supply shed near Elkmont stumbled across a misplaced duffel bag. The name tag was faded, but still legible, Rivera. Inside, investigators found what at first looked like ordinary camping supplies. A half-empty fuel canister, an unopened pack of dehydrated meals, an extra wool shirt, and then, buried at the bottom, a weather-stained notebook sealed in a Ziploc bag, a journal. The handwriting inside belonged to Josh Rivera. The first pages seemed ordinary enough, the casual scrawl of a teenager keeping track of the days. May 19th. Hiked 6 miles today. Dad says we made good time. Legs sore, but view worth it. Little observations about the trails, the wildlife, the ache of carrying too much gear. It read like a time capsule of a trip that should have been nothing more than a father-son adventure. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. Dad keeps saying we're fine, but I think we're lost. We pass the same ridge again today. I swear I recognize the same fallen tree. He says I'm imagining things, but I know I'm not. Water's running low. He won't admit it, but he's worried. Each entry felt like a descent, not just into the wilderness, but into uncertainty. Josh's writing grew more desperate, his words quicker, the margins filled with anxious scribbles. Investigators would later describe it as watching a mind unravel on the page, line by line. One passage, dated May 22nd, sent chills through everyone who read it. Something's wrong with Dad. He gets confused, says we're close to the trail, but then changes his mind. He looks at me like he doesn't recognize me sometimes. I'm scared to sleep. I don't know what's happening. When Detective Isabel Cruz read those words, she knew this case was no longer just about a father and son lost in the mountains. It was about something far darker. The discovery of the journal raised more questions than answers. Forensic testing confirmed it was genuine. Josh's handwriting matched school records, and the pages were dated consistently with the time they disappeared. But how had the duffel bag ended up back at Elkmont? Searchers had combed that area dozens of times. The Park Service swore the shed had been cleared out the previous year. The unsettling possibility emerged. Someone had placed it there later. Ranger Kyle Bennett, who had been part of the initial search, found the development both promising and troubling. If the bag was moved, he explained in a recorded interview, then we have to consider human involvement. Either they were found by someone who didn't report it, or someone wanted to leave us a message. The Rivera's relatives clung to the journal as a bittersweet lifeline. Elena Rivera read her son's words with trembling hands, her tears soaking into the ink. She insisted the entry showed Josh's resilience, his will to survive. But Raphael, Daniel's brother, saw something different. He noticed the way Daniel's behavior was described. Confused, forgetful, almost dangerous. He couldn't ignore the implication. Was his brother losing his mind out there? The tension between them grew sharper with each discussion. Elena defended Daniel fiercely. He adored Josh. He would never hurt him. Raphael stayed silent, his expression carved from stone. The journal became the centerpiece of speculation. Online forums lit up with theories. Some readers insisted Daniel had developed sudden altitude sickness or a neurological condition that led him astray. Others whispered about darker possibilities. Was Daniel deliberately misleading his son? Was the disappearance less an accident and more a father spiraling into something unspeakable? Detective Cruz tried to cut through the noise. The danger with these kinds of finds, she told reporters, is that they can tell us just enough to spark imagination, but not enough to give us certainty. What we need is corroborating evidence. Still, she admitted privately that one line haunted her. He looks at me like he doesn't recognize me sometimes. To a trained investigator, those weren't just the words of a frightened teenager. They were the signal flare of something irreversible unraveling in the wilderness. By late 2021, the Rivera story had slipped back into the shadows of public memory, drowned out by other headlines, other crises. But those closest to the case could never let it go. The journal sat locked in an evidence room, a relic of a boy's last known words, as silent as the forest that swallowed him and his father. And yet, the Smokies kept their secrets, because just beyond the ridges where searchers had turned back, just beyond the streams that maps insisted were too shallow to matter, the truth was still waiting, buried in the soil, hidden in the trees, and biding its time to be found. By 2022, the Rivera case had become less of a headline and more of a shadow. In the early months, their disappearance had been front-page news, vigils, press conferences, daily updates from search teams. But as the months bled into years, attention drifted elsewhere. The public had moved on. The forest had reclaimed its silence. And the Rivera family was left to endure a different kind of waiting, one that was heavier than grief, the waiting for certainty that never came. It was in February 2022 when the process began. Elena Rivera sat stiffly in a county courthouse, hands knotted together, her wedding band digging into her skin. The petition in front of her was simple on paper, but devastating in practice. Under Tennessee law, a missing person could be declared legally dead after a prolonged disappearance with no evidence of survival. For Elena, it wasn't just paperwork. It was surrender. Detective Isabel Cruz was there, too, though her role was limited. She spent the last 2 years pursuing every lead, each one fizzling into dead ends. She still carried the journal in her mind like a weight. Josh's frantic words about his father's confusion, the implication that something had gone terribly wrong. Yet there was no body, no belongings beyond the misplaced duffel. Nothing solid enough to prove what had happened. The courtroom was nearly empty that morning. Just Elena, her attorney, and across the aisle, Rafael Rivera. He sat in silence, his posture rigid, his grief hardening into something colder. He hadn't wanted this hearing. To him, declaring Daniel dead was an insult. One more way to erase the man he insisted had been misunderstood, maligned by Josh's journal entries. When the judge asked Elena to speak, her voice cracked. "My son, my husband, they deserve peace." "I can't," she faltered, pressing her hand against her chest as if holding herself together. "I can't keep waiting for them to walk through the door. I pray for a miracle, but if that miracle never comes, I need to face what's real." Raphael couldn't stay silent. He rose suddenly, his words echoing in the quiet chamber. "You're wrong. Daniel isn't gone. You all want to bury him because it's easier than facing the truth. But you don't know him like I do. He was strong. He knew those woods." His voice wavered, cracking on the last word. The judge let him speak, then gently reminded him the law required closure in situations like this. And in that moment, with a stroke of a pen, Daniel Rivera and his son Joshua were declared legally deceased. For Elena, it felt like betrayal. She clutched the order with trembling fingers, her tears falling not just for her husband and son, but for the cruel finality of a system that had to move forward even when the heart could not. The declaration fractured the family in ways no one could repair. Raphael accused Elena of giving up too soon. Elena accused Raphael of clinging to denial at the expense of healing. Their phone calls stopped. Family gatherings grew tense or disappeared altogether. The Riveras, once bound by love, now orbited each other like strangers, their grief cutting them apart instead of pulling them closer. Detective Cruz observed all of this from the sidelines, and she hated it. She had been trained to chase evidence, not watch families unravel. But she also knew something none of them wanted to admit. The Smokies had claimed countless lives before, and sometimes the forest never gave them back. Still, she couldn't let go of the journal. Every so often, she pulled the photocopies from her file, reading Josh's words late into the night. "He looks at me like he doesn't recognize me sometimes." That line haunted her, whispering possibilities she couldn't silence. Was Daniel suffering from some undiagnosed condition? Did he lead them deeper into danger, believing he was leading them out? Or was there something more sinister, something no one wanted to name out loud? Cruz knew the declaration of death didn't mean the case was closed. It only meant the paper trail was. In the years that followed, the case grew quieter still. A few local journalists revisited it every anniversary, writing features about the Smokies' lost father and son. True crime podcasts picked it up occasionally, speculating wildly about Daniel's mental state or the possibility of foul play. Online sleuths dissected the journal word for word. Some convinced Daniel was the villain, others believing he had been unfairly vilified. But for the family, the silence was suffocating. Elena withdrew from public life, her grief turning inward. She began counseling with Dr. Laura Grant, a family crisis specialist, who urged her to rebuild her life. But every attempt at moving forward was haunted by the absence of a gravesite, a place to mourn. She prayed nightly, but her prayers felt unanswered. Raphael, meanwhile, clung to the opposite. He became almost obsessed, revisiting the Smokies on his own, combing trails that had been searched a dozen times over. He carried Josh's journal pages with him, rereading them in the woods as if hoping they might align with some landmark, some forgotten clue. To him, Daniel's honor was on the line. "My brother wasn't weak," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. Something else happened to them. And in the shadows of all this grief, life went on. Tourists hiked the trails where the Riveras had vanished. Families camped near the ridges that search teams had once combed for clues. The forest grew, seasons turned, and time layered over the mystery like moss over stone. But then, 3 years after the declaration of death, everything changed. It began not with a hiker, not with a search party, but with technology. In the summer of 2023, a wildlife researcher named Dr. Maya Kapoor launched a drone project to track elk migration patterns deep in the Smokies. Her work had nothing to do with the Rivera case. Yet one afternoon, as her drone scanned a narrow ravine rarely visited by people, the camera captured something that jolted her upright in her chair. At first, it looked like just another cluster of rocks and brush, half hidden under years of fallen leaves. But when she zoomed in, the shapes became clearer. A torn piece of fabric, something metallic catching the light, and then, unmistakably, the weathered outline of a hiking boot, wedged in a place no one thought to look. Kapoor froze. Then she replayed the footage, frame by frame, her pulse racing. The Smokies, silent for 3 long years, had finally spoken, and what they revealed would not only shatter the official narrative of Daniel and Josh's disappearance, but divide the Riveras in a way no one could ever mend. The Smoky Mountains had been quiet for nearly 3 years. Quiet enough that most believed the Rivera disappearance had faded into legend. But on the morning of July 14th, 2023, inside a cramped research lab at the University of Tennessee, the silence cracked wide open. Dr. Maya Kapoor was not looking for mysteries. She was looking for elk. Her grant was straightforward. Study migration patterns in undermapped sections of the Smokies using drone surveillance. But when her drone skimmed over a ravine locals called the Devil's Hollow, the camera feed lit up with something that didn't belong. At first, it was just shadows and brush. Fallen leaves, twisted branches, the dark shimmer of wet stone. But then, fabric. A strip of navy blue, snagged beneath a rock. She zoomed in, pulse quickening. The material was weathered, torn by time and weather, but unmistakable. Not bark, not moss, something man-made. Her assistant, a graduate student named James, leaned over her shoulder. "That's not wildlife," he muttered. The camera drifted further. There, metal glinting faintly in the sun, half buried under layers of debris. Kapoor adjusted the angle, her hand trembling as the drone descended lower. The image sharpened. A boot, scuffed, cracked with age, its sole peeling away. And beside it, a shape that made her throat tighten. A skeletal arm, pale and fragile, stretched out across the ground as if frozen mid-reach. Kapoor pulled back sharply, nearly dropping the controller. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. She wasn't supposed to find this. This wasn't her field. Yet, staring at the grainy feed, she knew instantly what she had uncovered. The Riveras. The footage was turned over to park authorities within hours. By nightfall, Detective Isabel Cruz's phone rang, jolting her awake. She had stopped expecting this call years ago. Her first thought was a mistake. Another false alarm, another cruel lead that would collapse under scrutiny. But when she saw the drone footage of herself, her doubts withered. The next morning, teams were mobilized. The ravine was treacherous, narrow, choked with undergrowth, nearly invisible from established trails. Cruz had never searched this deep. The fact that the drone even caught it at all seemed like fate. By mid-July, under the blistering Tennessee sun, investigators descended into the hollow. The air was damp, thick with insects. The ground sloped sharply, demanding ropes and careful footing. And then there it was, exactly as the footage had shown. A boot lying on its side, torn fabric, once part jacket, bones scattered among the rocks, sun-bleached and fragile. The elements had claimed them, but there was no mistaking it. After 3 years, the Rivera mystery had surfaced from the earth. Cruz crouched near the remains, her heart hammering. She had braced for this moment, told herself countless times that one day the mountain would give them back. But facing it, seeing bones where a boy once laughed, a father once stood, was different. Heavier. "Bag everything," she ordered, her voice tight. Careful. Every fragment, every scrap. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. By the next day, headlines blared across Tennessee. Remains believed to belong to missing father and son found in Smokies. The Rivera's phones lit up with messages, Reporters crowded their lawns, and social media churned with speculation. Elena Rivera fell to her knees when Detective Cruz called her directly. Relief and devastation struck her in equal measure. Closure, yes, but also the brutal finality she had prayed against for 3 years. Her son, her husband, they weren't coming back. Raphael, however, felt something different. When he saw the footage release the press, his jaw set in anger, not grief. "No," he muttered. "No, this isn't right." Because among the artifacts recovered in Devil's Hollow was something the public hadn't yet been told. Something that fueled Raphael's rage. A backpack, weather-beaten, straps torn, but intact enough to recognize. Inside, investigators found fragments of food wrappers, a rusty utility knife, and, most damning of all, Josh's journal. It hadn't been destroyed by the elements as many assumed. Pages were warped, ink smudged, but still legible. Words that had haunted Detective Cruz for years were now preserved in evidence bags, proof that the journal was no fabrication. And the last entry, the final words Josh ever wrote, deepened the mystery. "Dad is worse today. He keeps saying things that don't make sense. He tried to walk us back, but I think he's leading us deeper. I don't think he knows where we are anymore. He gets angry when I ask questions. I'm scared. If something happens to me, please." The sentence trailed off. The page ended there, jagged at the edge as if torn or unfinished. The journal's recovery reignited the firestorm. News outlets speculated endlessly. Was Daniel suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness? Did he intentionally mislead his son? Or was Josh's perception unreliable, shaped by fear in the wilderness? Families were divided. 2. Elena clung to words as evidence that her son had been terrified, desperate, perhaps endangered by his own father's unraveling. Raphael, on the other hand, denounced it all. "You don't know what those words meant," he shouted at reporters. "You're twisting his memory. Daniel was not a monster. My nephew was scared, yes, but fear doesn't make his father guilty of anything." For Detective Cruz, the discovery offered answers and questions in equal measure. She finally had remains to confirm death, but not cause, not sequence, not what, in those final days, truly passed between father and son. And so, instead of closing the case, the drone footage cracked it wide open. As August wore on, forensic teams worked tirelessly. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Daniel and Josh. DNA tests reinforced it. The Smokies had kept their secret for 3 years, but now the evidence lay in sterile labs, waiting to speak. And still, whispers grew. Podcasts latched onto the last journal entry, dissecting every word. Online forums spun theories, some outlandish, some chillingly plausible. Had Daniel suffered a psychotic break? Had he grown violent? Or was there someone else out there in the woods? Someone whose presence Josh had never dared to put into words? One thing became clear. The Rivera's tragedy was no longer just a family's private grief. It was a national mystery. And as the footage replayed endlessly on screens across the country, the world leaned closer, demanding the answer to one question. What really happened in Devil's Hollow? The bones arrived at the Knoxville Medical Examiner's office under gray skies. Rain washed down the loading bay as investigators wheeled and sealed crates, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt. For 3 years, the Riveras had been nothing more than names on a missing persons report. But now, here, they had form. Fragile, fragmented, yet heavy with meaning. Dr. Helen Marks, the state's chief forensic pathologist, had been through thousands of autopsies, car crashes, murders, overdoses. But this case carried weight beyond science. She knew every movement or scalpel, every conclusion in her report, would ripple through families and the public like shockwaves. Laid out on sterile steel tables, Daniel Rivera and his son Josh were reduced to what time and weather had left behind. Daniel's skeleton was more complete. Spine curved unnaturally, ribs fractured. Josh's remains were smaller, scattered, some gnawed by animals, others clean from the elements. For hours, Mark studied bone by bone, running gloved fingers along fractures, noting where, measuring trauma. She dictated into her recorder, voice steady but sharp. Adult male, Estimated age 38. Advanced weathering of remains consistent with 3 years exposure. Signs of perimortem trauma. Fracture of right parietal bone. The words hit Detective Cruz like hammer blows. She stood behind the observation glass, arms crossed, her jaw tightening. A fracture in the skull. That wasn't weather. That was impact. She leaned closer. Cause of death? She pressed, her voice carrying through the intercom. Marks didn't look up. Not yet. But this isn't natural. Something struck him. Her hand shifted to Josh's bones. Smaller, lighter. When she reached the child's ribs, she paused. Several were cracked, some in ways that suggested blunt trauma before decomposition. She sighed into the recorder. Juvenile male, estimated age 12, evidence of antemortem rib, fractures, possible struggle or compression. Cruz felt her stomach twist. This wasn't the mountain slowly claiming 2 lost hikers. This was violence. 2 weeks later, the preliminary autopsy report landed on her desk. Daniel Rivera, skull fracture from blunt force trauma. Inconclusive whether accidental fall or intentional strike. No knife wounds. No gunshot evidence. Cause of death, undetermined, consistent with head trauma. Joshua Rivera, rib fractures, possibly from restraint or force. Malnutrition signs, bones thinner, weaker than expected for age. Cause of death, undetermined, possible starvation or blunt trauma. The report was clinical, detached. But between the lines, the implication screamed. If Daniel had suffered a blow to the head, who delivered it? If Josh's ribs were broken, who had done it? And why? Cruz slammed the file shut, her pen tapping against the desk. For 3 years she had imagined closure as a clean ending. Bodies found, cause of death established, story complete. Instead, the puzzle was messier than ever. The Rivera family received the news in fractured silence. Elena wept openly when Cruz explained the findings, clutching a photograph of her husband and son against her chest. Starve? They think he starved. Her voice cracked like glass. No, Daniel wouldn't let that happen. He loved Josh. He would have given the shirt off his back. Raphael, on the other hand, sat rigid, eyes narrowed. You're twisting this, he said. You want to make him into some monster who hurt his son. That's not what happened. That's not who he was. But then came the journal again. Raphael had refused to accept its words as anything more than a scared boy's imagination. Now, though, paired with the autopsy, its meaning sharpened like a knife. Josh wrote of fear, of confusion, of his father leading them deeper, of anger. And now Bones told a story of fracture, of hunger, of desperation. The more the evidence aligned, the harder it was to deny. Maybe Josh had been right to be afraid. By September 2023, the case had exploded online. Podcasts dissected the autopsy report like scripture. Every fracture spun into new theories. True crime forums lit up with debates. Did Daniel snap under pressure, becoming violent toward his son? Did Josh lash out against his father in a desperate act of survival? Or was there someone else in Devil's Hollow that both father and son never accounted for? Some argued that the skull fracture could have been a result of a fall, slipping on slick rock, hitting stone at the wrong angle. Others countered that Josh's ribs told a different story, a more human kind of violence. But one theory above all caught fire. On a forum dedicated to missing persons cases, a user posted a grainy scan of a map leaked from the investigation. Scribbled in pencil along the edge of Devil's Hollow were 3 words, faint but legible. Not safe here. The handwriting matched Josh's. Detective Cruz reviewed the leaked evidence late one night, fluorescent lights buzzing above her. She rubbed her temples, staring at the words until they blurred. The journal, the fractures, the bones, all pointing to something darker than simple misadventure. But she also knew how evidence could deceive. Bones break in accidents. Journals reflect fear, not fact. Scribbles could be misinterpreted. What haunted her most was the timeline. The autopsy indicated malnutrition in Josh's final weeks. That many lived longer than many assumed. Perhaps days, maybe even weeks after Daniel's death. If that were true, the boy hadn't just vanished into the wilderness. He had survived, alone, terrified, starving, long after his father was gone. And then something else happened. Something that ended his life, too. The report was supposed to close the Rivera case. Instead, it turned it into a firestorm. Family against family. Public against police. Grief against truth. When the findings were announced formally in October 2023, the press conference erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Are you suggesting foul play? Who's responsible? Cruz stood firm at the podium. We are not labeling this case as a homicide at this time, she said. What we can confirm is that trauma occurred. Our investigation remains open. We owe it to Rivera family and to the public to pursue every lead until we know the truth. Behind the cameras, Elena wept silently, clutching tissues. Raphael shook his head, muttering to himself. The divide between them, once a crack, now gaped like a canyon. The mountain had given up its dead, but not its secrets. For every answer, two new questions arose. What struck Daniel? Who, or what, caused Josh's rib fractures? How had the boy survived in the hollow after his father's death? The autopsy hadn't ended the mystery. It had deepened it. And now, with a nation watching, Detective Cruz felt the weight of something she had long feared. The truth was coming, but when it arrived, it would break more than it healed. The bones should have been the end of it, a sad conclusion to a sadder story. But the hollow wasn't finished with the Riveras, or with Detective Cruz. It began with a single cardboard box. In December 2023, just weeks after the autopsy report was made public, a retired volunteer searcher named Eddie Collins walked into the Millbrook Sheriff's office with something he claimed he had forgotten in his garage. He was wiry, red-faced, the kind of man who'd spent too many summers cutting trails and too many winters smoking unfiltered cigarettes. He set the box down on the counter with a grunt. Inside were artifacts from the 2020 searches. Leftovers, he said, that had never been logged. Tattered rope, a pair of rusted tent stakes, and an old backpack caked in mud. Cruz didn't buy it for a second. Nothing in a high-profile missing persons case accidentally sat in a garage for 3 years. Still, she signed a chain of custody sheet and carried the box into evidence. When the backpack was cleaned, the initials DR emerged faintly stitched inside. Daniel Rivera's. Inside the bag were scraps of food wrappers, a torn section of map, and one item that froze Cruz in place, a compact, weather-stained video camera. It was waterlogged, corroded around the seams, but the casing was intact. She sent it straight to the state's digital forensics unit in Hawthorne. Weeks passed. Then the call came. We managed to recover partial files, the technician said. Not all of them, but enough. Cruz's pulse quickened. Send them over. The first recovered clip was brief. Daniel Rivera, sweat-soaked, his face gaunt but determined, speaking directly to the camera. It's day 9. We're deeper than I thought we'd be. Josh is tired. I keep telling him it's fine, but he trailed off, glancing at his son in the background. The boy sat hunched on a rock, knees drawn to his chest, refusing to look up. The file ended abruptly. The second clip was darker. Literally. Shot at night. The lens picked up only the glow of a small campfire. Daniel's voice was hushed, frantic. Something's out here. I keep hearing it. I don't know if it's animals or... A snap echoed in the background, and Josh's thin voice cut in. Dad, it's closer. The feed glitched, static filling the frame, before cutting out. The third and final salvageable file was only seconds long. A blurred image of Daniel's face, eyes wide, breath ragged. He whispered into the camera. If anyone finds this, it wasn't an accident. Then nothing. Corrupted silence. When Cruz played the clips in the evidence room, the air thickened. Every investigator in the unit leaned forward, straining to catch each word. Raphael slammed his fist on the table. He's saying someone was there. Someone was after them. Elena wept quietly, shaking her head. No, Daniel, what did you do? The footage didn't answer anything. It only poured gasoline on the fire. The leaks came almost immediately. A low-level clerk in the Hawthorne Forensics office uploaded the clips to an anonymous forum before the sheriff's department could contain them. Within hours, They were viral. Rivera death tapes, headlines screamed. YouTubers dissected each frame, blowing up grainy pixels and claiming to spot shadowy figures just beyond the firelight. Podcasters argued whether Daniel's final words were confession or warning. Theories metastasized overnight. The stalker theory. An unknown person followed the Riveras into Devil's Hollow, leading to their deaths. The cover-up theory. Daniel uncovered something in the wilderness. Illegal logging, secretive government testing, and was silenced. The collapse theory. Daniel, exhausted and unstable, turned on his son, and it wasn't an accident. Lying was a fractured attempt at absolution. The case was no longer a local mystery. It was a national obsession. By January 2024, the FBI stepped in, not because they had to, but because the digital evidence hinted at something larger. Agents reviewed the footage frame by frame, analyzing ambient noises, timestamps, and distortions. One detail stood out. In the second clip, at the moment Josh whispered it's closer, the spectrogram picked up something faint in the background. Not animal noise, not wind, a voice, low, indistinct, but human. Cruz sat in the FBI's analysis lab, staring at a waveform as it replayed through headphones. A hiss, a pop, then, not safe, barely audible. But there, she ripped off the headphones. Played again. The technician obliged. And there was, over and over, a murmur buried in static. Not safe. It matched the handwriting in Josh's journal. When Cruz presented this finding to the sheriff, his face darkened. "This thing's spiraling out of control," he said. "We're 3 years into a case that should have been closed, and now we got national media, internet sleuths, and half the town whispering about some phantom in Devil's Hollow. You know what this does? It tears the community apart. Again." But Cruz didn't care about the politics. For the first time, she believed what she hadn't let herself believe before. Daniel and Josh hadn't simply lost their way. Someone, or something, had been with them. That night, Cruz sat in her kitchen, footage looping endlessly on her laptop. Daniel's hollow eyes, Josh's hunched silhouette, the whispered voice in the static. She thought of all the people who had entered Devil's Hollow searching for answers, and of how many had come back with nothing but questions. The Hollow was a place that didn't just swallow bodies. It swallowed truth. But now, for the first time, truth was clawing its way out. And Cruz knew one thing with icy certainty. If she followed it all the way to the end, the Hollow might never let her go either. If you've been drawn this far into the story, take a second to hit that subscribe button. Every week we bring you tales that are chilling, emotional, and unforgettable. And trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one ends. By February 2024, the Rivera case had consumed everything around it. News crews camped outside the Millbrook Sheriff's Office. Drone hobbyists combed the ridges of Devil's Hollow, chasing viral fame. True crime podcasts dissected every syllable of Daniel's final words. Detective Marisol Cruz, already haunted by the footage, was running on fumes. She'd been living the case for months. Her nights cut into jagged fragments of replayed whispers, her days swallowed by interviews that led nowhere. Then came the call. The receptionist patched it through late on a rainy Tuesday night. A man's voice, gravelly, hesitant. "Detective Cruz? I think it's time I tell you what I know about Daniel Rivera." Cruz sat up straighter. "Who is this?" "Name's Frank Harlan. You remember me when you see me." He gave her an address on the outskirts of Millbrook and hung up before she could press further. The Harlan place was a crumbling farmhouse, half swallowed by kudzu. Cruz parked on the dirt shoulder and knocked. The man who opened the door was in his late 60s, stooped, his skin weathered from years of sun. But Cruz did recognize him, vaguely, from old police records. He'd been one of the earliest landowners in the Hollow, before selling parcels to the state. Inside, the air smelled of dust and stale tobacco. Harlan gestured her to sit at a table scarred with knife marks. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, though Cruz didn't touch hers. "You want to confess to something?" she asked, recorder already running. He gave a low laugh that dissolved into a cough. "Not confess. Clarify. People out there." He jabbed a finger toward the window, toward the TV crews camped across the county. "They don't understand what Devil's Hollow is. But Daniel did. Eventually. Cruz's patience was thin. Mr. Harlan, the footage we recovered. Daniel says it wasn't an accident. What does that mean? Harlan's eyes gleamed. It means he found out what I told him not to look for. He leaned in, voice dropping. In 2019, before they disappeared, Daniel came to me, said he wanted to take his boy camping, asked about safe routes. I told him, same as I told everyone, stay out of the inner hollow. The ground shifts there. Sinkholes. Old mine shafts nobody ever mapped. Things that move under you. Cruz frowned. And you think that's what killed them? No. Harlan's lips pressed into a thin line. I think Daniel got curious. And I think he saw the lights. Cruz stiffened. Lights. Harlan nodded slowly. Happens every few years. Folks pretend it's swamp gas or some backcountry trick. But Daniel, he wasn't satisfied with stories. I saw him the week before he vanished, muttering about how he'd prove it wasn't just folklore. He said he was going to film it. He reached beneath the table and slid a folder across. Inside were photocopied notes, old maps, and scribbled journal pages. Cruz flipped through them, pulse quickening. Scrawled in Daniel's handwriting. They're not stars. They move against the trees. Not safe. The same phrase Josh had written. The same words whispered in the corrupted footage. Her throat tightened. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Harlan sighed. Because people who poke too deep into Devil's Hollow don't come back whole. And because the state doesn't like messy explanations. Easier to let the Riveras be another tragedy. Close the file and keep tourists happy. He drained his glass, then looked at her with hollow eyes. But now the tapes are out. The truth's crawling into the open, whether anyone wants it or not. And you need to know, Daniel wasn't the first. I've seen hunters vanish, hikers, even surveyors. Always the same. They talk about the lights before they go. Cruz's recorder kept rolling, but her own heart was thundering. This wasn't the confession she'd expected. Not a neat admission of guilt, but something stranger, heavier. She tried to anchor him. Mr. Harlan, are you saying Daniel Rivera didn't die of exposure or accident or violence, but because he was chasing lights? I'm saying, Harlan whispered, leaning close enough she smelled the whiskey on his breath, that something lures people in, something they can't turn away from once they've seen it. And Daniel took his boys straight into it. The words lodged in Cruz like splinters. When she left the farmhouse, rain hammering her windshield, she played the recovered clips again in her head. Daniel whispering, it wasn't an accident. Josh's small voice, it's closer. The faint distortion, not safe. It wasn't just panic. It wasn't just paranoia. Daniel had been trying to document something real, or at least something he believed was real. And Harlan had just confessed, in his own roundabout way, that he knew the hollow devoured those who tried. But the strangest part came after Cruz returned to the station. She pulled Daniel's bag from evidence again, sifting through its contents with shaking hands. Inside a hidden inner pocket, one no one had checked, she found a folded scrap of waterproof paper, written in smeared ink, almost illegible. Elena, if you find this, tell Josh I tried. The lights aren't what they say. If I don't come back, don't let them tell you it was an accident. It was signed with Daniel's initials. Cruz sat frozen. Every hair on her arms rose. Daniel had left 2 confessions, one in video, one in writing. Both pointed away from accident, away from misadventure, towards something intentional. But intentional by whom? That night, she hardly slept. Her dreams were fevered replays of flickering lights between skeletal trees, of Josh whispering warnings, of Daniel staring into lens with eyes that had already glimpsed something he couldn't name. By morning, Cruz knew the hollow wasn't finished. Not with her. Not with anyone. And if she wanted to survive the answers, she'd have to go into Devil's Hollow herself. March 2024. Detective Marisol Cruz parked her SUV at the dead end, where the dirt road gave way to tangled pine and oak. The world was damp and heavy after an overnight storm, the air thick with the smell of wet soil. She zipped her jacket, slung her pack over her shoulder, and stared at the dark tree line ahead. This was it. Months of fragmented evidence. corrupted footage, whispers of lights, Harlan's confession. It had all led here. Devil's Hollow. The forest swallowed her quickly. The sound of her boots against wet earth faded beneath the drone of cicadas and the occasional crack of a branch. Cruz moved slowly, every sense sharpened. The hollow had a reputation for distorting time and direction, and even with a GPS tracker clipped to her vest, she felt the pull of disorientation. At first it was just forest, dense, unremarkable, the same as any other stretch of backcountry. Then, gradually, the air seemed heavier. The silence deepened. Even the cicadas fell quiet, as though holding their breath. Cruz checked her watch, 2:13 p.m. She blinked, looked again. 3:47 p.m. Her chest tightened. Hours, or maybe minutes, later, she stumbled into a clearing. The ground was uneven, scarred by old sinkholes. Moss covered the rocks in patches that looked too vivid, too saturated, almost phosphorescent. She raised her flashlight, even though the sun was still up. That's when she saw them. Lights. Not bright. Not like lanterns or flashlights. More like faint orbs, pale and trembling, weaving lazily between the trees. They moved as though alive, never still, drifting closer when she blinked, retreating when she focused on them. Her heart slammed in her chest. She remembered Daniel's journal. They're not stars. They move against the trees. Cruz lifted her camera, but the lens refused to focus. The lights blurred, warped, jittered across the viewfinder. And then, just for a second, the screen went black. A whisper bled into her earpiece. Not her own voice. Not feedback. Not safe. Her hand shook. She pressed deeper, every step heavier than the last. She found a shredded blue tarp half buried in the mud. A cracked plastic toy car, rusted from years of rain. Fragments of a backpack strap. All of it Daniel's. Josh's. Her throat closed. She crouched and touched the toy car gently, as if it might vanish at her fingertips. That's when she heard it. A boy's laugh. Faint, high-pitched, carried on the wind. She spun. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkening woods. Nothing. Only the faint shimmer of the lights. Her radio crackled. Static first, then a warped voice. Elena, if you find this. Her blood ran cold. It was Daniel. The same words from his note, but warped, distorted, bleeding out her own comms device as if the hollow itself was speaking them back. Daniel. Cruz whispered, against all reason. Where are you? The lights pulsed, closer now, like a slow heartbeat. Panic clawed at her chest. She stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root, landing hard in the mud. The flashlight clattered out of her grip, beam spinning wildly until it caught something pale against the earth. A fragment of bone. Then another, and another. She froze. The clearing wasn't empty. It was scattered with remains. Not just one set. Dozens. Hunters, hikers, lost souls swallowed by Devil's Hollow. All those who had seen the lights before. Her breath came ragged. She scrambled to her feet, fumbling for her pack, for anything that might anchor her. The lights surged. Not menacing, not kind, simply insistent. They wanted her to follow. Her rational mind screamed to turn back, to run. But her feet betrayed her. One step forward. Another, as though the hollow itself had reached inside her skull and rewired her will. She remembered Harlan's words. Something lures people in. Something they can't turn away from once they've seen it. And she understood now. It wasn't curiosity alone that doomed Daniel. It was compulsion. Her last coherent thought was of Josh's whisper on the tape. It's closer. And then, nothing. The search team found Cruz's SUV 3 days later. Inside was her badge, her jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat. Her GPS tracker pinged for 36 hours, then cut off abruptly at the edge of Devil's Hollow. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead. Another tragic accident, in a place already infamous for them. But the townsfolk of Millbrook whispered a different ending. Some said she'd become part of the Hollow now. Others swore they'd seen her face flicker in the lights at night, mouth open as though trying to warn the next wanderer. Months later, a camper uploaded shaky cell phone footage to the internet. The video was dark, unfocused, But in the distance, between the trees, something shimmered. Lights, pale and trembling, weaving lazily against the branches. And just before the clip cut to black, a woman's voice bled through the static. Not safe. The internet tore itself apart debating whether it was real, a hoax, or a cruel prank. But in Millbrook, no one laughed. Because everyone knew the hollow wasn't finished. Not yet. They say time heals everything. But in Millbrook, time doesn't heal. It circles back. 4 years have passed since detective crews vanished in Devil's Hollow. Daniel and Josh's names are etched into a weather-worn plaque by the ranger station. Just another pair of statistics among the lost. Tourists still hike the Great Smokies, unaware of the shadows that breathe between those trees. But locals don't camp there anymore. Not after sundown. Not near the hollow. Because sometimes when the fog is thick and the night goes still, people swear they hear laughter. A boy's laughter. Sometimes a woman's voice calling their name. And if you're foolish enough to follow the lights, you may never find your way back. The files remain open, marked cold. The questions remain unanswered. And the hollow, ancient patient, waits. Because in Millbrook, the woods don't just keep their secrets. They keep you.